Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Kay Stefanik, Assistant Director of the Iowa Nutrient Research Center. I want to welcome you to our Iowa Nutrient Research Seminar Series, Highlights from a Decade of Research and Impacts. We have two speakers today who are going to be talking on hotspots, prairie potholes, and prairie implementation. Our first speaker is Dr. Stephen Hall. He's Associate Professor in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Organismal Biology with a background in biogeochemistry and ecosystem ecology. And he's going to be speaking on hotspots and prairie potholes.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much, Kay and Malcolm and Matt, for the opportunity to share some of our recent and ongoing work. And so kick it off. Most of the folks right out in the audience are familiar with scenes like this driving around north central Iowa in the spring, especially after it's been raining, right? And what you see is substantial portion of our farm fields may be underwater, right? We see sort of the relic topography and poor drainage characteristics of the soils making themselves apparent. And this is not just a unique phenomenon in north central Iowa, right? We know that poorly drained soils are really fairly widespread throughout the US Corn Belt. And so this is a map where all of the colored pixels show the land that has been recently cropped to corn or soybeans along with its drainage class. And what you can see is a lot of blue on this map. So over 20% of our soils that are cropped to corn and soybean have a natural drainage class of poor to very poor. And if we add up the implications, right, this is especially important during wet years, but across both wet and dry years, on average, about 17% corn yield loss, perhaps as a consequence of excess moisture. And if we go down to the field scale, I think this is a nice illustration from one of the recent papers from Bill Crumpton's group. We can see these depressions, right, the zones of crop mortality, which can be sizable within individual fields, right? And so even though most of this agricultural landscape, especially in north central Iowa, has extensive drainage infrastructure, we still see this periodic flooding, especially in wet years, but even in years like 2022, right, relatively dry overall, but you'll still see drowned out pothole depressions in many cases as a result of a rainfall event at just the wrong time. And so we know it's sort of visibly apparent what the impacts are in terms of crop production, but I think we know much less about these features and their impact on water quality and climate, and that's what I'll try to share today. So I think it's really important to note, how dynamic these poorly drained depressions are. And this is a great data set from Amy Kalita and colleagues in the ABE department here. And the key point I'm trying to make is that these depressions have really flashy hydro periods. And so this is a time series of water depth where each one of these colored circles is a different depression that was monitored close to the Iowa State campus, where a number of us have ongoing research. And you can see that these depressions tend to pond water differently, but they're all ponding water for periods of hours to days or even weeks during an average year, or whatever an average year might mean these days. And want to contrast this from maybe more the hydro periods of more traditional wetlands in our region. They may not be flooded all the time, but tend to be more consistently flooded for longer periods during the year. And so it's sort of a consequence of these differences in hydrology and drainage and crop production. We had some hypotheses that we wanted to test here. And we thought that these depressions might actually be hotspots of nitrogen and phosphorus leaching, sort of as a confluence of multiple factors, right? The fact that we're killing off the crop, we're concentrating the runoff of water and nutrients from the surrounding catchments. In addition, we thought that these might also be hotspots of greenhouse gas emissions, so nitrous oxide, N2O, and methane, CH4, again as a consequence of this variable hydrology. And then finally, we wanted to assess whether these depressions are actually good spots to store organic carbon and how effective they might be at this under current management. And we thought as a consequence sort of this variable hydrology, they might not actually be so effective at storing carbon. And so I'll share a few different sort of vignettes getting at these questions. And sort of the common theme is that what we're doing is we're going to look across gradients from poorly drained depressions and then up into the adjacent upland landscape, slightly better drained conditions, less ponding. So I'll share data from a few sites close to Iowa State campus, as well as some other places around the state on a variety of different measurements and field studies. So first I'll talk a little bit about some measurements of nutrient leaching we made in depressions and uplands over 3 years, so 2018 through 2020. The figure in the top right, you can sort of get a sense of the kind of scale of these measurements. These white dots are sampling points from the bottom of a depression into the adjacent upland. And at these different sampling points, what we're doing is we're burying these resin lysimeters. So these are pipes that are filled with ion exchange resin. We install them through these access tunnels underneath undisturbed soil, and we leave them there for a year and allow them to accumulate nutrients that are leached through the soil. And then we dig them out. Here's an example in the bottom right here of a soil or a lysimeter excavated after 1 year, encased in soil. And we extract that resin and we quantify the nutrients. And so we have a few different kinds of cropping systems that we examined here, sort of traditional corn, soybean, with a cover crop, as well as some sites that were planted to miscanthus here by colleagues at ISU. And so we're going to aggregate all of these point measurements to try to understand the impact of these depressions. And so what we found, if we bring all these data together, we find that depressions had really consistently greater leaching of both nitrogen and phosphorus across sites and study years. And so each one of these points here in this box plot represents the mean of a bunch of these different lysimeters that we've averaged to try to get us a handle on the spatial variability. And then we're comparing it with a paired upland measurement. So that's what these lines are. And so there's a median difference of about 56 kilograms of nitrate N per hectare between depressions and uplands across these years that have differences in rainfall, ranging from relatively wet to drier conditions. A similar story for ammonium, obviously not as much N being leached in that form, but the results were also striking for phosphorus. An average median difference of about a little over 2 kilograms of P per hectare per year between depressions and uplands. And so folks that are familiar with these kinds of data might be sort of alarmed at the absolute values here. And I think, you know, there's a whole story to go into with how to interpret these absolute values. I think suffice it to say that these relative differences, I think, are fairly robust using this method. Okay, so what are the effects of different cropping systems, right? And so there's a number of sort of challenges in interpreting these data from real working farms, right, that have lots of idiosyncratic differences. And so what we did here is to report what I'm calling the excess depression nitrate. And that's the difference in nitrate leaching between a depression and its adjacent upland. And we can compare this across different kinds of cropping systems. And what we find, perhaps not so surprisingly, is that systems with a cover crop tend to have much lower excess depression nitrate leaching than corn soybean systems that don't have a cover crop. Similar story with miscanthus, even, you know, if we consider miscanthus during the establishment phase. And so folks that don't know, miscanthus is a perennial grass that's a candidate bioenergy crop that shows maybe some promise at surviving in these poorly drained environments. Okay, so the question, right? So why are these depression soils leaching so much nitrate? Well, I think there's a number of potential mechanisms, right? And so we can think of, you know, each one of these sort of micro watersheds that's contributing to a depression, right? All of this area is potentially concentrating water and nutrients from surface and subsurface flow into the depression. So even if these are relatively poorly drained soils, we have a large input. We've got potentially low nutrient uptake in crop biomass if the crop is drowned out or if it's stunted because of the excess moisture. And we also have preferential flow. We have some evidence for this in these depressional soils. And so if there's a period where they dry out, the shrink swell clays in these depressions can essentially create these large cracks through which water can move really quickly following subsequent rainfall events. And I won't dive into this story in detail, but we've got some nitrate isotope measurements that really support this idea of inconsistent denitrification and preferential flow of nitrate through these depressional soils. Okay, so switching gears, talking briefly about nitrous oxide emissions, right? So if you're not aware, nitrous oxide is one of our most potent greenhouse gases on a mass basis. It's potentially one of the largest climate impacts of our agricultural systems. And we were really curious about how these emissions might differ between depressions and their adjacent uplands. And so to get at this, we developed a new method that allows us to make high frequency measurements in areas that are periodically wet, like these depressional environments. And so what we're able to do then is collect a lot of measurements with this automated system and begin to sum up the emissions on an annual basis, both within and among years. And so I'll briefly walk us through some of those data. So on the y-axis here are the cumulative emissions of N2O over a year. So this is 2017. The x-axis, these different bars, are different plots along this transect where we measured nitrous oxide. So 0 is at the bottom, and then we're moving upslope here to the right. And so what you'll notice is not too much of a topographic signal here, right? There's maybe slightly greater N2O emissions close to the depression boundary, but otherwise not a huge difference. These different colors represent the different periods of time when the N2O is emitted. It's sort of interesting to us that despite the greater moisture in the depression, not a huge signal evident in the N2O emissions. I have a couple more years of data here to share. 2018 was a soybean year, so no fertilizer application. You might also remember this is a really wet year in north central Iowa. We do have a few plots with relatively high emissions right at the bottom of the depression, but also potentially high emissions at the top. You'll also notice in this color scheme, the timing of emissions tends to differ between depressions and uplands. So there's some interesting biology and chemistry going on there that I won't dive into here. Similar story for 2019, actually a trend towards lower emissions in the depression, but again, a different timing relative to the uplands. And so really the key take-home point here is that all of these soils, regardless of their moisture regime, are capable of producing high N2O fluxes given the right environmental conditions. And the overall fluxes were generally higher than many others have assumed, particularly in sort of the broader emissions inventory approaches, such as those used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So several-fold greater emissions than what we would assume under sort of the conventional emissions inventories. Okay, and so overall, right, so maybe not evidence for the role of depressions as hotspots, but I think this really deserves further attention, right, because the response seems to really vary as a function of when rainfall is arriving and how that interacts with other soil factors. Okay, so to shift gears, the last part of this vignette here is going to focus on soil carbon, right, and so you might expect that these poorly drained depressions might be good places to accumulate carbon on the landscape. And what I think is less clear is what are the underlying mechanisms that might be at play. So here's sort of some similar kinds of data to what I've shown you earlier. So the x-axis shows a topographic gradient where 0 is the boundary of a depression. Negative values are sort of in the depression itself, and positive values are farther upslope. And what you see is a really consistent trend of increasing soil carbon as you're moving deeper into the depression, right? And so, okay, about maybe a twofold difference on average between the bottom and the top of the transect. So what's another really interesting fact about this data set, though, is if we can start to look at where this carbon might be coming from. And so these are some stable isotope data. And so don't worry about what these numbers mean if you're not familiar. We can use this as an index of where this carbon might be coming from. And what we see is a huge shift right about at the depression boundary from a carbon that's more dominated by a C4 plant, such as corn. We see this shifting down to carbon that looks much more like C3 plants in terms of origin. And so this is really intriguing. It looks like, well, maybe modern agricultural carbon is not really contributing very much in these depressions, given that it tends to be dominated by C4 plants. So what's going on here? So we made a whole host of additional measurements in collaboration with a bunch of colleagues at Iowa State, particularly Amy Kalita, who generously provided some data sets on ponding in these depressions. And what we found was sort of surprising. we found that actually particle size, so the amount of silt and clay, fine particles in the soil sample, is actually the best predictor of increased soil carbon across all of these different depressions and sites, right? That can explain the lion's share of the difference in carbon. And we can look at ponding time, and we actually find that soils that have a greater extent of ponding tend to have less carbon on average after we account for other factors, right? And this is really interesting. Furthermore, we find that samples with greater iron tend to have lower carbon. And so it comes to, maybe suggest a story where in these soils that are experiencing fluctuating saturated and drying conditions, oxic and anoxic conditions, we may actually be stimulating decomposition at the same time that we're suppressing the inputs of carbon from plant biomass. And so the key point is that in these systems with erratic hydrology, just having greater overall ponding won't necessarily mean that you're going to accumulate more soil carbon. And in fact, maybe the evidence is pointing to the role of erosion and just moving carbon across the landscape, essentially ending up with more of this topsoil that's moving downslope essentially and accumulating in these depressions. Okay, I'm going to skip this story for sake of time. This is sort of a lab experiment that sort of nails home that idea that these fluctuating moisture environments are not necessarily great for storing carbon. I'm going to move back to sort of the take home here, right? And so propose these three hypotheses that these tile drain depressions are potential hotspots of nitrogen and phosphorus leaching. So pretty good support for this hypothesis across a number of different sites and study years and management systems. The idea that these depressions could be hotspots of nitrous oxide and methane, this really depends on year. Again, I ran out of time, didn't have time to show you methane data. They will sporadically emit methane, but again, it really depends on the year and the amount of time that these depressional soils are inundated. And finally, there's some evidence that just because these soils are intermittently soggy doesn't necessarily mean that they are disproportionately storing organic carbon. This may simply be distribution of carbon across the landscape that we're seeing in these depressional soils. And so I guess the question is, well, where do we go from here, and how might we better manage these systems to improve their environmental services? Well, I think there's sort of a no-brainer here. And in terms of if you're going to farm these systems, try cover crops and reduce tillage. So we showed that there's less of this excess depression nitrate leaching in systems that have cover crops. There's some evidence elsewhere that decreasing tillage and allowing soil structure to develop can actually decrease the ponding in the depressions, maybe help the crop survive. And another perhaps more controversial idea is that if you're going to grow crops in these depressions, you might as well try to get a crop out of them. And this may mean in some cases actually looking at changes in the drainage system and potentially increasing drainage and combining that with other sorts of strategies, such as establishing wetlands to remove nitrate at tile outlets, right? Try to balance these two different services that we're trying to get out of these landscapes in terms of crop production while minimizing environmental impacts. Some other, tentative data suggesting that, well, maybe these fields with abundant depressions might be good candidates for perennial biomass, right? It's great work at Iowa State examining the feasibility of those kinds of systems. So stay tuned, but maybe promising initial results here. And finally, I think, it's maybe one of the best ways to actually address these tandem issues of water pollution and climate is to think about where it makes sense to restore wetlands in these fields that have large depressions in particular, right? Take advantage of existing financing programs and cost share to restore wetlands, possibly wetland hydro periods as well. But really, I think the challenge, talking with farmers, is that it's hard to fit wetlands into the geometries of modern row crop production, right? These are not neat squares or rectangles, and how to manage among, infield restorations could be a challenge. But I think maybe that provides the best opportunity for removing nitrate and avoiding N2O emissions while actually trying to gain soil organic carbon and taking advantage of these poor drainage conditions that we have in these systems. So, okay, I've done talking, but these folks did all the work. So Wenjin Huang, Nate Lawrence, former PhD student, Carlos Tenesaka, research scientist in my group. And thanks very much to INRC for providing seed funding for a couple of these projects, and for our other funders who have done this. And also especially to all of the numerous collaborators at Iowa State who have contributed to various aspects of this work. So hopefully I didn't go too long. All right, great.
Move on to the next presentation, but we'll have about 10 minutes for questions at the very end. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Let's see. Should I just get right into it, Kay?
Yeah, if you want to bring up your screen and I'll introduce you as you're doing that. Okay, so our second speaker is Dr. Justin Meissen. He is a Research and Restoration Program Manager at the Tallgrass Prairie Center at the University of Northern Iowa. His background is in conservation biology, restoration ecology, as well as botany, and he's going to be talking about prairie implementation. Oh.
All righty, very good, thank you. Okay. Yes, so today I'm going to be talking about how we can make tallgrass prairie plantings that are more consistently successful and multifunctional. So to start off, I'd like to give a little brief introduction to the Tallgrass Prairie Center. So we're an organization based out of the University of Northern Iowa. And our mission too is to empower people to value and restore resilient, diverse tallgrass prairie. The center was born out of Iowa's native roadside vegetation program back in the 1990s. Since then, it's grown in scope to multiple programs. Some of the other programs other than my own is our plant materials program, which is focused on getting more native seeds to the market. And we also have the Iowa Roadside Management Program, where we support managing native vegetation on roadsides around the state. And then finally, we have our Prairie on Farms program, where the objective is to integrate prairie into agricultural landscapes. And today we'll be talking about research which is related to some of those aims. So when I talk to people working in Iowa and upper Midwest more generally, a lot of people have their own conception of the term prairie. To some people, it means land with any kind of presence of tall grass. Others, it means a plant community with a very specific history and list of plant species. So to make sure we're all on the same page today during this presentation, I'll be using a fairly broad definition. So prairie today is going to be an open-grown mixed stand of grasses and wildflowers native to Iowa. And the map here shows the original extent of tallgrass prairie grasslands, which is represented on the left by a photo of an original tallgrass prairie remnant. So we've defined what prairie is. Now let's talk about why it's important. So one of the key roles that these mixed native grasslands can provide is to act as a very effective nutrient reduction tool, especially when placed strategically as vegetated strips at the edge of the field or infield on conventional farms. The strips team at Iowa State's done some foundational research that quantifies those benefits. And through their work, we know that by adding prairie vegetation to 10% of crop fields, we see really big nutrient reduction benefits. While the nutrient reduction capabilities of prairie are definitely extremely significant, probably the most compelling thing about them as a conservation practice is their potential to provide lots of co-benefits. Or we could put it another way, saying that prairie is highly multifunctional. By nature, as species-rich grasslands, the dominant deep-rooted native grasses drive a lot of benefits related to soil health and hydrological regulation, while the coexisting native forbs provide resources for pollinators and other wildlife. So as these benefits become more widely recognized, we're seeing attempts at putting prairie or prairie-like vegetation back on the landscape. Recently, we've seen a really significant push in conservation programs, especially in USDA's Conservation Reserve Program, to encourage these kinds of practices. And you can see here that this chart shows how fast the adoption of prairie practices have been in Iowa up until about 2020. And then starting with signups in 2020, we now have another new USDA conservation practice, prairie strips. And so, of course, we just looked at the benefits of this practice in the last slides, and given the flexible nature of that practice, it has a ton of potential to be widely adopted and make a significant impact on ecosystem services on Iowa landscapes. But that potential also means it could be widely adopted by folks without much experience planting native vegetation. And given the potential for so many of these new adopters, it's important that we can ensure that they succeed with their first experience, since that's going to help secure long-term buy-in and expansion of practice. Because prairie is also more expensive than other practices, and it is a long-term practice, the stakes are raised a little bit. And so it's really even more important that these new prairie plantings are highly ecologically functional. So how can we make sure farmers succeed with prairie conservation practices on the first try? Well, one way is to make sure there's strong design and implementation guidelines available that can reliably lead to success. So what influences successful ecological outcomes? Seed mix design is one of the biggest determinants of project costs and outcome in prairie reconstructions. One aspect of seed mix design that's particularly influential here is the grass to forb seeding ratio based on number of seeds sown. Designing a mix in which the seeding rate of one functional group is either too high or too low could have adverse effects on specific ecological outcomes. So, for example, seed mixes where the grass seeding rate is too high can produce grass-dominated stands that sort of outcompete forbs, which don't have a lot of pollinator habitat value at that point. Conversely, seed mixes in which the grass seeding rate is too low could produce stands with low cover that are susceptible to weed invasion and provide less protection against soil erosion. First-year management can also influence costs and outcomes. Fast-growing annual weeds are almost always a problem in post-agricultural sites. And if the annual weeds establish and become dominant before prairie seeds germinate, they can reduce native establishment and increase long-term management costs. Timing of seeding is also an important factor. It's something luckily relatively easy to implement. Most prairie reconstructions are seeded during spring, April to June, or the dormant season, November to March. And for many species, particularly forbs, cold moist stratification for up to 90 days can be required for dormancy breaking. And while most conditions for dormancy breaking are met when you do dormant seeding, those opportunities don't exist in the same way for growing season plantings. So if we want to be able to provide good implementation guidelines, we need to understand how all of these techniques affect successful prairie establishment, and how they might be used to optimize outcomes in prairie plantings. So our research objectives here, we wanted to one, investigate the design and implementation techniques that produce the most ecological co-benefits. And two, we want to understand how consistent those techniques are in producing successful ecological outcomes. So today I'll mostly be presenting data from some recent publications in restoration ecology, specifically this paper led by Alec Glidden, which was just recently accepted. I won't have a lot of time to go into significant depth of the data from these, but we will cover some of the data highlights. So to get at these research questions, we established a series of field experiments. So initially, we began with the experiment located at ISU's Northeast Research Farm in Nashua, which was initiated in 2015. And we replicated that design and added an additional treatment to another experiment that was established in 2018. So throughout the talk, I'll be referring to this first experiment as Nashua and the newer experiment as CF. Give you a sense of the methods here. Experimental design. We followed a blocked split plot design, and we looked at 3 implementation techniques: seed mix, mowing, and planting season. So at both experiments, we looked at 3 seed mix treatments that varied primarily in grass to forb ratio. We planted a forb-dominated pollinator mix, which was high cost, a grass to forb balanced diverse mix, which was moderately cost, and a grass-dominated economy mix, which was low cost. We also looked at mowing treatment, where we either did no mowing or we kept the stand mowed to about 5 inches throughout the first year. Ended up being about 4 times, more or less monthly. And that was also applied at both experiments. And then finally, we looked at 2 planting season treatments in the CF experiment, where we planted in the dormant season on November 15th and in the spring on April 28th. So we collected data from these 2 experiments from their initial establishment through this year. But to standardize our analysis, we're going to focus on year 2 data. And that's what our most recent publication focuses on. So the results we're going to talk about today will represent sort of establishing prairie plantings in their second growing season. And mostly we'll look at the results from the CF experiment, but we'll also compare results between experiments towards the end. So to quantify ecological benefits in our treatments, we measured key vegetation metrics in each experimental plot. So to estimate erosion control, we looked at zone stem density and native canopy cover. To estimate weed resistance, we measured canopy cover of annual and perennial weeds, as well as bare ground cover. And then to measure pollinator resources, we looked at inflorescence density and floral richness. So let's take a look at the results. We'll be looking at a series of similar graphs here, so let's orient ourselves. On the y-axis, we've got stem density broken out into native grasses on the left and native forbs on the right. Responses are grouped primarily by seed mix, which is the x-axis, and then further by planting season, denoted by triangles, dormant planted, circles, spring planted, and mowing by open, mowed, and filled, unmowed shapes. And we've got significant differences noted by letters here. So what we found is that stem density was generally affected by seed mix and mowing treatments, but not so much planting time. As you might expect, the grass-dominated economy mix had the highest graminoid stem density, and the forb-dominated pollinator mix had the lowest graminoid stem density. The diversity of pollinator mixes had more stems than the economy mix, forb stems that is. And then with mowing, mowed subplots had a higher graminoid forb stem density than unmowed plots. Now, while planting time didn't influence overall stem density in grasses or forbs, it did influence functional group composition. I don't have time to go in depth with this today, but the short version is that dormant season planting favored establishment of important functional groups for pollinators, specifically spring and fall blooming forbs, which often are in short supply on a larger landscape. Okay, so with weed resistance, we found that seed mix, mowing, planting time were all affected some aspect of weed and bare ground cover. So here, from left to right, we're looking at perennial weed cover, annual and biennial weed cover, and bare ground cover. So seed mixes, grass-dominated economy mix had the lowest annual weed cover, but otherwise seed mix didn't have a big effect here. And then mowing reduced annual weeds and bare ground, and dormant season planting reduced perennial weed and bare ground cover. So taking a look at pollinator resources, we can see, again, seed mix, mowing, planting time, all affected floral abundance, the left graph, and richness, the right graph, in some way. So with seed mixes, the forb-dominated pollinator mix produced the most inflorescences, but the balanced diversity mix produced the most floral richness. Mowing increased both inflorescence production and floral richness, and dormant season planting increased floral richness. Okay, so now let's look at how consistent the effects of implementation techniques were. So this table is showing the impact of seed mix on ecosystem service provision in the two different experiments. So for each site, Nashua or CF, the seed mix with the highest value for each variable is scored as 100% highlighted, and the other seed mixes are scored as a relative proportion of the highest value. So for example, the first row for erosion control, sown cover, the economy mix produced the highest cover in both experiments, with the diversity mix producing 89% of the cover the economy mix produced in the Nashua experiment and 88% in the CF experiment, and then so on for each variable experiment site. So more similar numbers between experiments shows more consistency of effect. So what we see when taken together is that the differences in ecosystem service provision between seed mixes were comparable between the two experiments. The economy mix was consistently the best at sown cover and stem density at both sites, whereas the diversity mix consistently excelled at bare ground absence and floral richness. And then the pollinator mix consistently produced the most flowers. So to save a bit of time here, I'm not going to show the table for the impact of mowing on ecosystem service provision in the two different experiments, but the trends are essentially the same. Consistency in outcomes between experiments. So let's summarize what we've learned here. So in order to establish a prairie that produces the most co-benefits at once, we found that one, designing seed mixes with a balanced amount of grasses and forbs produces most of the benefits of the grass or forb-dominated seed mix. First year mowing improves nearly all ecosystem services. And lastly, the dormant seeding improves some aspects of weed resistance and pollinator resources. We also found that the effects of these implementation techniques are predictable and consistent between sites. Specifically, that's referring to seed mix and first year mowing. So if we had to boil it down to just one sentence, I think it's this. To optimize outcomes in Iowa prairie plantings, we should be seeding a grass forb balanced seed mix in the dormant season and mowing throughout the first year of establishment. So to start wrapping up, I'll just briefly discuss some of the other cool things that have come from this research. First, some of these results that we talked about today are starting to show up in policy recommendations. Some new publications from the USDA, like this technical note that came out last year, now specifically recommend establishment mowing, balanced seed mix design for prairie strips. We also partnered with the ISU Strips team, Pheasants Forever, to establish several additional on-farm research and demonstration sites throughout northern Iowa, on which we've hosted a lot of in-person and virtual field days that have reached hundreds of ag and conservation professionals. So while I only had time to present one study today, we have done and continue to do other research on prairie implementation and prairie restoration ecology topics. So for those interested, we have several technical reports covering today's topic, but also others that cover additional topics like prairie seeding depth, seed mix cost effectiveness, and others. And those can be found on our research and restoration program website, which is posted on the slide here. So with that, I'd like to thank my collaborators, funders, and I think we have all of our time left for questions.
All right, so we do have about 10 minutes for questions for either of our presenters. If you are online, please type your questions into the chat box. And while people are working on their questions online, are there any questions in the room for either of our speakers?
Yeah, well, thank you both, Stephen and Justin, for sharing your research here today. Really interesting stuff. Stephen, I was wondering with the resin lysimeters, it was having a really hard time trying to get a sense for scale in the
Sure.
pictures. And so can you talk a little bit about that methodology and
Absolutely, yeah. I didn't want to go into great detail, but they're essentially 2-inch diameter pipes, about 5 centimeters tall. And so the way we get over the small scale, it's a balance between, you could have a large lysimeter and have more disturbance, or smaller lysimeters and make smaller holes and try to get better contact with the soil. And so that's essentially what we've chosen. This method is actually developed by colleagues at originally in California and really sort of popularized by folks at University of Illinois and used in a number of studies. And the challenge is the spatial variability. And so we get over this by doing 3 replicates at each plot and aggregating that, and then doing a lot of plots. And there is a large coefficient of variation, but with hundreds of lysimeters, you can quickly sort of get a story of what's going on. And because essentially it's a resin matrix with sand to protect it from the soil, you might increase the preferential flow through the lysimeter. So that may be why in these clay-rich soils we get large leaching values, because there may simply be more water moving through the lysimeter than the matrix. But essentially that's standard across your site. So I would say it's like a good relative measure, and the absolute values may be a little high. And when you compare it with like tile drain plots, they are higher. And there's a number of reasons for that. But yeah, that's sort of a partial deep dive, I guess, on the method.
Yeah, well, certainly being in the upper part of the soil profile, right, as opposed to lower.
Yeah, and so I would actually say that's actually less maybe of a concern. And so we thought a lot about that, and we chose 35 centimeters depth because that's essentially the layer where 2/3 of the corn and soybean root mass, fine root mass, is above that. And since most of the leaching is happening before the plants are even getting established, that's another consideration. Also, there's great work on denitrification distribution within the soil profile done by IRC soil scientists in the 80s. The names are escaping me, but essentially they found that below 30 centimeters, denitrification just pretty much vanishes because of carbon limitation. And sort of that was sort of the rationale for keeping it at 35 centimeters, because that lets us do a tunnel with a hand auger, as opposed to getting like a bulldozer into the site and making a giant mess of the area. So yeah, no, that's a great question though.
Cool. Yeah, and how much does it cost to deploy?
Yeah, so that's the other thing. It's not too bad. It's the time in making the lysimeters and going out to the field. So it's if you compare it with like a tile drain plot, right? It's a huge difference. But I think it's allows you to get at different kinds of questions. So that kind of spatial variability you can get with this method that you can't necessarily with the traditional like drainage plots. Yeah.
And if anybody online would like to unmute to ask your question, you're free to do that as well.
Stephen, I was interested in the different crops that you were comparing in the potholes, and thinking about the push to put like the bioenergy crops in the marginal lands, and then the question of whether we tile these plots to remove the drainage to allow for crops to grow, or to think about planting like miscanthus had the lowest delta among the different crops that you studied. Do you think that would be a good practice to think about thinking about growing the treating the potholes like a marginal land and planting the scianthus there? What is the feasibility of that?
I mean, that's a great question for Emily Heaton or Andy Van Lukey, right? Looking at the, so they have the better data on the crop survival and biomass production. And I think a lot of it, right? Yeah, unfortunately, like everything else, it depends, right? It depends on the characteristics of the particular depression, whether or not it will survive, and the sort of the timing of when you plant it, and is it a wet year when you plant those perennial crops, and can you get the rhizomes to survive and establish? I mean, I think that's a real advantage of like going for a prairie, right, where you've got species with different tolerance for inundation, and you can naturally buffer those differences in hydro period that you get from year to year and site to site.
I have a question for Justin. So yeah, thanks very much. The work that you've done on the species mixes is always just so interesting. And I probably asked this before, but it'd be great to review it again. So when you put together the seed mixes, other than sort of the, overarching, plant, forbs and grasses, right? What do you use to try to, figure out which species to include, right? At more species level considerations.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it is sometimes it's pretty tough to come up with an ecologically based decision framework. Often it is simply based on how much you can afford. Ideally, you kind of develop that seed mix from sort of historical species lists of Iowa or parts of Iowa, and kind of based on those species abilities to persist in different kinds of soil, moisture, and chemical characteristic, then you either choose to include or exclude based on that. There's also you can also add things that are objectives based, like milkweed and certain other nectar plants for monarchs. So a lot of that stuff is getting compiled into, I guess you could say, expert opinion based information that comes up against the cost realities of how much some of these species cost. So it's a question with many, many aspects of answer to it, but generally it's species characteristics and tolerance of soil conditions, and how much you can afford to put in. So hopefully that's somewhat of a helpful answer.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
And to follow up on that, hi Justin, thank you for your presentation, and you Stephen, but I have a question for Justin. If I remember right, you also developed a selection tool that people can use themselves, right, depending on their goals, at least to some extent, like, and I don't know, maybe you built on it to include any like wildlife considerations as well as pollinators.
Yeah, so the Tallgrass Prairie Center, we've got our Tallgrass Prairie seed calculator, which basically does take those soil moisture considerations into account, as well as some general concepts related to broadcast versus drilling, adding more seed to make up for some of the losses based on the way that you're seeding. But we don't have any of those specific wildlife categories that we have incorporated in the calculator, but definitely is a good idea to try to focus on that, because there's definitely some species that are kind of big hotspots for certain pollinators. Certainly monarchs love liatris, but obviously milkweed, a variety of other plants that we have pretty good literature on. But currently we haven't integrated that into the physics calculator, but I hope in the future we can get around to that.
Thanks.
Okay, I just want to thank both of our speakers again. Before we end today, I have two quick INRC announcements. So if you are attending this for Certified Crop Advisor Continuing Education Unit, please send me an email at kcstefan@istate.edu by tomorrow, November 10th at noon. Make sure you include your name, the name you entered to attend, as well as your CCA number. And then our next seminar series is going to be Wednesday, December 14th. And the focus is going to be on modeling. We're going to have Soterius Arcantulus as well as Crystal Liu presenting. All right, with that, I think we'll end things for today. Thank you, everyone who attended.
Well, thank you.